Today on Freedom Alive, the life-choosing options the abortion industry doesn't want you to know. Today, you'll meet some modern-day heroes. Welcome to Freedom Alive. We have inspiring stories for you today as we take a look at the subject of pregnancy and adoption. Over the years, so much has changed in science and pro-life options that it's time we take a fresh look at this issue. Plus, Matt will give us his Liberty Alert. Since the terrible 1973 Supreme Court abortion opinion, science has established that life begins at the moment of fertilization. Pregnancy help centers and Christian adoption ministries have spread throughout the country. These ministries are providing innovative solutions to mothers who are facing this life or death decision. Today, our guest, Vicki Matthews of Choices Women's Clinics, will give us an inside look at the pro-life options available today. Matt, of all the issues that we've touched on with Freedom Alive, and there are many, and they're all big, is there any closer to God's heart than what we're going to talk about today?
There's not. Life is the right of all rights. Without the right to life, other rights that we have are meaningless. And for God, Jesus says He is the way, the truth, and the life, that He is the resurrection and the life, that He ultimately is the creator of the universe, and He's the creator of life. He's the sustainer of life. And when we ultimately take innocent human life, particularly the most vulnerable, because you think about how Jesus was so incredibly drawn to, and the children were drawn to Him, these young innocent children, and imagine that with these little innocent babies that are literally brutally murdered in the womb, the place where it should be the safest of all places. That is the ultimate insult to God, and it's the ultimate insult to the woman and to humanity in general. It is the issue, and there is no issue that's greater than that.
I agree. I can't wait. For those of you at home, we are going to the front line of a life and death issue, and you're not going to want to miss a minute. But first, Matt's Liberty Alert is next.
The United States Supreme Court just decided to take a case that could overturn the terrible abortion decisions going all the way back to 1973, the infamous Roe v. Wade case that ultimately, quote, legalized abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy. This case comes out of Mississippi. The law in Mississippi banned abortions after the baby becomes viable, able to live outside of the mother's womb. Relying upon the Supreme Court's 40-plus years of decisions, the lower court said that this law is unconstitutional. Now, they didn't like the fact that they had to reach that conclusion, but they said that the Supreme Court has already ruled that you cannot ban abortion prior to viability. Why would the Supreme Court take a case when the lower courts actually followed its 40-plus years of precedent? Because they're wanting to obviously reconsider the 40-plus years of precedent. This is an incredible case, and it will be before the Supreme Court later in 2021, and then in 2022, a decision will come down on this important case. It could be the end of this infamous Roe v. Wade decision. In fact, in order to take a case, you need at least 4 justices. But in order to win, you need 5. Obviously, I believe there's obviously 4 justices that want to reconsider Roe versus Wade in the abortion decisions. But I don't think that the 4 justices would take a case like this unless they could count the 5th vote. This is an exciting development. I believe in my lifetime, and I've said this for many years, that we will see the abortion decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court reversed. And we must return our country, the United States of America, back to an ethic of life, to support the sanctity of human life, to support our most vulnerable neighbors among us, those innocent children in the womb. Continue to pray for this case that abortion ultimately ends in our lifetime.
Matt, thank you for that alert. I wanted to ask you to spend just a minute on the Supreme Court justice piece of what you mentioned, the 4 justices. There are many that say this will be the first walkthrough for the new Supreme Court justice, the way that it's now configured. Can you speak to that?
Well, we have 4 justices that are no longer there: Connor, Souter, Kennedy, and Ginsburg, and they have been replaced by other justices, and 3 of those justices are appointed by President Donald Trump. So it's a new day at the Supreme Court, and consequently, this could be the case, and the fact that they took this case really now makes it real that they may likely overturn these terrible abortion decisions.
For those of you at home, please pray. This case is a big deal. We look forward to bringing you more information in the upcoming weeks and months ahead. But right now, it's our interview with Vicki Matthews of Choices Women's Clinic.
Well, I'm very excited about our show today with Vicki and what you're doing, helping so many women. I can't wait till we get to some of these videos of real women whose lives have been incredibly changed. Yes. Little babies that are growing up that otherwise would not be with us, but for the ministry that you do at your center. Tell us about how you actually first got involved in helping women who are going through crisis pregnancies and helping them to not only walk through that, but also, in some cases, even to adopt. How did that come about?
Well, a lifetime ago, back in the 1980s, I was involved in a church that was very vocal about the life issue. And I had had an abortion in my past before I came to know Christ. And that was kind of like, that was old. That's something we don't talk about. And through that, I found myself at a training for a pregnancy center that was opening in South Florida. And there is where I really, for the first time, realized that I had aborted a baby. I know that sounds probably strange to some people, but in the 1980s, we didn't have ultrasounds. We aborted a crisis, but similar to today, you know, I don't believe that any woman wants to have an abortion. I believe she feels, and they may feel, a couple may feel, that's their only choice.
And at some point when you realized that you actually had aborted your child, did you have the guilt, and how did you ultimately be freed from that? And now where you're ministering to this day?
Yeah, well, like many times like that in our life, it was a process. It wasn't a check off the box. It wasn't a quick fix. But I really had to deal with myself, and I had to deal with, could God really forgive me from that? And I found that he could, and he did. And then, you know, when he says that he can turn those things around for his good and his glory so that we can be effective for the kingdom of God, you know, it became my passion. I didn't know it was my passion, and I certainly didn't know that 35 years later, I would still be doing this work. But when he calls you and he uses an experience in your life to truly change from ashes to beauty, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing.
Well, what was intended for evil, obviously God is now using for good. And so I want to go to this video of a woman, Michelle. And Michelle is someone who has an incredible story, but it could have been a very tragic story.
Yes.
Watch this video.
I made an appointment to the abortion clinic. I went there, they gave me the pills. It took me a couple of seconds to put the pills in my mouth while I was still crying. And I was praying, God, make it not work. Before I find out I was pregnant, I was not expecting that. I was not planning to have a baby, so I find out I was pregnant, and I thought my choice was to have an abortion. I didn't have anybody to talk to at the time. All my emotions, all my feeling was still inside. My boyfriend, he did not want to talk about the baby. He did not want to hear what I had to say. He was not on board. I did not know what to think or how to feel. Because the first time I went to the clinic, they gave me the pills and everything, and I took it. I went home, and nothing happened. So I went back, and when they did the ultrasound, I asked them if there was still a heartbeat, if there was still a baby. They said no, but I felt inside of me there was still a baby. There was a man in the front of the clinic talking about, you don't need to do this. And he heard me on the phone talking. He's like, do you need help? He come in and talk to me, and he brought me here. I was nervous. I did not know. I was praying. I was saying, please, please forgive me, help me, and give me a sign. When the ultrasound started, and she's like, yes, there was a heartbeat. I'm like, really? She's like, yes, it's right here, and I hear it. And she wasn't there. My mother is in Haiti. My father, we are not close. I have two brothers. They were not living here at the time. So I was pretty much alone in the choice of keeping her. When I saw her for the first time, I cried. She was so beautiful, so tiny, and they put her on my chest, and I was like, oh my God, look at her. I would never had her if I had stayed in this place and listened to this doctor telling me there was no heartbeat when I knew there was one. I was really happy to meet her and grateful to be her mother. Choices gave me the support that I needed. I had a baby shower after the baby was born, and I'm still amazed from all the things that I got from that baby shower. They make it like I feel like home, that I know I have a support, that I have somebody there for me, which I did not know that I had, and all these people came around to support me. And it's still emotional for me to talk about it. It's still hard, because how does like all these strangers know like somebody need help, we're gonna come around? It's just amazing. That never happened to me before. A lot of young mothers, a lot of women, when they get pregnant and they like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? They freaked out and they think that's the only way they can do it. That's the only choice for them, but it's not.
I don't know about you, but that video is incredibly moving. And the amazing thing is that this little child would not be alive. And this woman, Michelle, would have taken her child's life. But she came to your center, and that's just one of many, many stories. Tell us about what happens in your center. What is taking place? And I know there's some exciting things that have recently happened, and you've got another center that's right next to one of the largest, if not the largest, college and universities in the country, University of Central Florida.
Yes, yeah, exciting times for us, Matt. You know, women come to us, and men that come with their women, because they're seeking abortion. They don't come to us because they're looking for alternatives to abortion. They're not looking for nice Christians to tell them what to do. They're looking for an abortion. And because we're able to provide the resources they need to make an informed decision and to empower them with every tool, every resource we can possibly give them, from ultrasound, STD testing, STD treatment, meeting with a licensed nurse, a licensed ultrasound technician, that's what makes a difference. And loving volunteers, advocates that are there to hear their story, to hear where they are in their decision-making process, or where they are in looking for an abortion.
And it's quite a contrast between what you do and what these abortion clinics do. They're making money off of literally wrecking lives and destroying young children, killing them. And in this case of Michelle, they had given her 2 pills, and God intervened and answered Michelle's prayer that those pills wouldn't work, which is an incredible miracle. But they actually lied to her as well, because they said that they didn't hear a heartbeat, and there really was a heartbeat. And God put it in her heart that, yes, my baby's still alive. And she comes to your center, and lo and behold, she hears that heartbeat. So you have that ultrasound where they can actually see the baby, which is incredible.
Right.
and they can hear the heartbeat of their baby as well. And then you have this other ministry. You have a new center that you're opening right next to the University of Central Florida, and it has 50,000 or more students, one of the largest universities in the country.
Yes.
That's an
yes.
exciting. Tell us
Huge.
about that.
So, our desire is to strategically go where abortions are happening, to change abortion in Central Florida. In order to do that, we have to go where abortions are happening. So I personally have a heart for those in college because that's where I found myself when I faced that, a devastating time. How are you going to tell your parents? How are you not going to complete those goals that you said you were going to complete? It's not really the right time at life when you're in college to choose life, to have a baby, to be a single parent, to get married early. So I really have a heart for that. And knowing that we're near the second largest, some people say the first, college campus in the country.
It's huge.
It's huge. There's a lot of abortions, and there's a Planned Parenthood right near campus that,
Is actually expanding.
Yes, that has expanded, that is doing late-term abortion through 21 to 24 weeks, which is legal in the state of Florida, as you know. And we want to make a difference there. So we pull out all the stops. We build a state-of-the-art clinic. It's beautiful.
And God has really blessed you in being able to raise resources to be able to open that facility debt-free.
Yes.
It's an incredible blessing that God brought to you. And you had a major walk of people in Central Florida that came and they supported the center. And it's one of the ways that you're reaching out to the community, but also bringing opportunities for people in the community to come and help the center as well. And that was an incredible success.
Yes. Yes.
Well, we want to talk about another story that's incredible as well, because it's one of the many, many ministries that you do at the Choices Center. And that is adoption. And in this case, it's the story of an incredible family and a special needs baby. And all of that came about because of how you have allowed God to use you in the center there. This is an incredible story of bringing opportunity in life to a special needs baby who otherwise might have been just tossed away.
When I found out I was pregnant, I was like, what am I gonna do? That was my only thought. What am I going to do? I went to the abortion clinic. It was a decision I thought I was going to have to make. And when I seen Mr. Burrows in front of the abortion clinic, he talked to me. And he told me, you shouldn't do this. He gave me the Women's Choices card. And I came here to Women's Choices, and it changed my mind. In my mind, there was no other option. I did not want to raise it. I did not want to kill it. Adoption. That's the only choice I had. And through the process, found great parents for a baby that I couldn't take care of. I don't know how it happened. The next minute, parents were not taking baby. These guys are not capable of taking care of a little guy that has special needs. It's my only thought, what am I going to do? Within 24 hours, God said, you know what? I had a perfect set of parents that they couldn't have fit any better. They were getting a telephone call coming to the hospital to have a baby.
On our way to the hospital, we thought we were just going to meet the baby and birth mom. We were just really excited. And on the way to the hospital, they call us and they tell us that they're discharging him. The drive there was definitely really emotional.
I cried the entire drive.
Then as soon as we met Catherine in the hospital, it was just like those nerves just kind of washed away. And we immediately felt at peace and at home together.
Well, today we're going to the Grand Floridian Hotel to meet my son Nash. I haven't seen him in 9 months.
We're gonna go see Auntie Kathy. Are you so excited?
He's gonna have a great life, and I look forward to being a part of that.
I know they're here. I'm excited.
I'm so excited. There he is.
How are you?
I am good. How are you?
Good. It's so good to see you.
Hey, Mr. Man, sleeping. How are you?
Good.
We're so grateful that Catherine chose life.
Because we wouldn't be parents if she didn't make that commitment. And then passing him on to us and blessing us with him, it just took both of us putting faith into it to make today a reality and a possibility.
What an incredible story of now this family has a child that they love, a special needs child, and the birth mother was through that whole process with them, and it all was centered through the ministry at Choices.
Yeah, so she was at the abortion clinic just like Michelle was at that same abortion clinic late term through 24 weeks of pregnancy. And, you know, there's a lot of backstory to those stories, even beyond the video. But that particular couple, you know, she picked out a family, a Christian family. We connected her to an adoption agency here locally. That family walked with her through that entire pregnancy. They were there on the day that that baby was born, and they were not prepared to adopt a special needs child. And no one knew that she was going to have a child with needs. And so they walked out of that hospital empty-handed. I can't even imagine the pain for all of them, including Catherine, our birth mom there. And she was pretty panicked at that point. But the adoption agency put out an SOS. And guess what? There was that couple, Nick and Jen.
Well, in the closing moments that we have, Vicki, it's just been a pleasure to be with you. Talk to our viewers, those who might be in that crisis situation, families, parents, friends that know somebody who is, and pastors. How do they deal with this? What should they say?
Yeah. We all will know somebody who is facing this crisis. I have no doubt that somebody will be watching this. Somebody's experiencing this. It happens in the church. It happens outside of the church. But what is our response to life that God intends? Not easy decisions, but a decision that you can live with. And what I have seen in my 35 years of doing this, I have seen people regret this decision of abortion over and over and over. We see women who come into Choices Women's Clinic who choose abortion, not because we point them in that direction, but because even after services, they feel that's their choice and that's what they have to do. And we're powerless to change a person's mind. Only the Holy Spirit can change a person's mind. So when they make that decision, they regret it.
Going off of what you just said, choosing life, you never regret it. But once you ultimately choose the opposite, to destroy that human life that God is creating and creates in you,
That's right.
You can never turn the clock back again, and you will regret that. So thank you so much for your incredible ministry.
Thank you, Matt. So wonderful to be with you.
For those that want to get involved, how can they best do that? Obviously, this locally with Choices, but also there's other people that are watching from around the country. How can they actually connect to a crisis pregnancy center?
Look in your local area. Look at the website that we're giving you today for Option Line. Connect with your community to be a part of changing lives, of pushing back the darkness, of making a difference. You know, if every person who just had an abortion, and not just because people who've had abortions need to be involved in this work, I certainly am called to do that, to make that difference all the days of my life. But if every person who's experienced abortion, every woman, man, grandparent, we would have so many resources.
Yeah. And you need resources because all that you do is free. So this is a great ministry, Choices. It's right here in Central Florida where we're located, but you're watching from around the country as well. Mm-hmm. And if you're seeking a crisis pregnancy center, you need to reach out to someone or give information to someone who needs to go to a crisis pregnancy center in their location. Go to optionline.org, optionline.org. You can put in the city. It'll bring up all the resources there. It includes adoption as well as crisis pregnancy centers and all kinds of different ministries that are available. Yes. Thank you, Vicki, for being a part of us.
Matt.
And thank you for standing for life.
Thank you for speaking up for life.
Matt, that was an amazing interview with Vicki. The life and death nature every day of those folks walking in and the decisions that they're helping people with and giving them that information. I don't think we would be doing this topic justice, though, if we didn't come back to what you had mentioned with Vicki earlier, that shocking contrast of what happens between choosing life and the really barbaric practices of the Planned Parenthood industry and the abortion industry, right?
Yeah, we represent Sandra Merritt, Steve, as you well know, and she was one of the two journalists that looked at what was happening with these abortion clinics in Planned Parenthood, and literally that they were like a shopping menu that morning, harvesting baby body parts, looking at the women that were coming in and they needed a heart, a liver, a lung, kidney, brains, or whatever else they needed, and they would then harvest them from these children. Some of them were born alive and then harvested from their organs and then given to these research clinics for thousands and thousands of dollars. It is a barbaric practice. It is not freedom. It is death of the worst sort that you can imagine.
For those of you at home who may be facing a decision like this, we just want you to know that God has an amazing plan for your life. He has an amazing plan for your baby's life, just like He has an amazing plan for all of His kids' lives. We just ask that you would please pray for Vicki, for so many others like her that are doing these amazing things. We're going to continue to bring you more on this issue. There is a lot more, and we're going to continue to stay on it in future episodes. Well, that's it for today, but be sure to tune in next week, where we will update you on existing battles and alert you to new government overreaches. We'll tell you about the victories people of faith are winning and how you too can fight back to keep your freedom alive. Watch Freedom Alive every week on this same channel at the same time.